daddy, Alec, and my mama. Her name is Mary. I'm named after her. I'm called Mary Elizabeth. My mama's name is Mary Elizabeth. They just call her Mary. I call her Ma or Mama, depends. And well, everybody calls me Melizzy. Now, I have a brother and I have a sister. And like I said, when we were growing up in Galveston, we just lived like we do. I mean, we lived on a plantation of sorts. We were enslaved to a family. But when I was about six, I don't know exactly for sure because I don't know exactly when I was born, but sometime around when I was about 6 years old, this man came onto the property where my family lived and was enslaved to this one particular home. And this man had come down to Galveston, Texas from someplace way up north. Now, they said that he had come from New York, but not the city of New York. Why, he had worked on the Erie Canal. So he had all kinds of experiences going up and down on that canal. It just sounded so interesting to me. But he had decided that he wanted to come down to Galveston. He wanted to come down to Texas. And he wanted to make a fortune for himself. He wanted to make a lot of money. So he had come down to Galveston and he'd started a bunch of businesses. Why, he had a hardware store, and he also loaned money to people because we didn't have a fancy bank, I don't think, but he would loan money to people and then they would pay him back with extra money on top. And that's how he started to make some money. But the reason he came to the place where we lived was because he was looking for somebody just like my daddy. You see, this man's name was James Morrow Brown. I don't remember if I told you that part. I know I told you he came from up north, but I don't know if I told you what his name was. Anyhow, Mr. Brown had fallen in love with a woman who also came from up north. Her name was Miss Rebecca, and Miss Rebecca had come from Pennsylvania or something like that. And well, Mr. Morrow Brown wanted to marry her, and he didn't want his bride to come and live in some regular old home. He wanted to build the finest house in Galveston. Now, in those days, we didn't have brick houses at all, but he wanted a brick house. Because he said where he came from way up north, there were lots of homes made out of brick and beautiful homes. So he came onto this property looking for somebody who knew how to build with brick, make the bricks and lay the bricks. And he had heard that there was a slave on the property who knew how to do it. And that man was my daddy, Alec. And so he was talking with them, you know, the slaveholder, and they made an arrangement that Mr. Morrow Brown was going to buy my daddy. But the arrangement was that he couldn't just take my daddy, that the whole family was going to come and live on the property as well. And so that's what happened. When all that transacted, we left where we were living and we moved into this little tiny home right off of Broadway in Galveston, where the property was. And my daddy got to work. Of course, he didn't do the work all by himself. And pretty soon there were all kinds of people working from early in the morning until late at night. But my daddy was the one in charge because he knew how to do the work. It took 4 years before they finally got that home together. If you can imagine, it was a long, slow process. But finally, in 1861, that beautiful home was finished. And when Miss Rebecca came down and moved into that home, she decided that she wanted to call it Ashton Villa. You see, she was an Ashton before she married Colonel Morrow Brown. I'll tell you about the Colonel in a moment. But she was an Ashton, and she'd had relatives who had fought in the Revolutionary War, and she thought that this would be the perfect name for this fine home. And I want to tell you that it was indeed fine. It was beautiful. Like I said, it was all made out of brick, and it was 3 stories high. But my favorite part was on the 2nd floor, because on the 2nd floor, almost the whole 2nd floor, but not entirely the whole 2nd floor, but the biggest room on the 2nd floor was called the Gold Room. You could probably guess why. It was painted the most beautiful color. Somebody's in the room, we better let them in. It was painted the most beautiful color. It was kind of a yellow, but everything, there were paintings on the wall, and they had gold all around them. And so, and the windows went from the ceiling all the way down to the ground, if you can imagine. So when the light came in, it just lit up that room, and you felt like you were standing in the middle of sunshine, you know, beautiful. And one of the most special parts about it was that it also had these, what do you call them? The French doors that would go from the ceiling down to the floor, all made out of glass. And you could open up those French doors out onto a balcony. And that balcony had these beautiful railings that were made out of wrought iron. And you could just step out onto that balcony, and you could look across all the property. And if you really looked, you could see way downtown. Oh my goodness, it was beautiful. Of course, let's see, that was 1861, like I said, when the home was done. And well, you all probably know what was happening in 1861. By now, you might know better than I did at the time. But that's the time when that Civil War started. Like I said, I didn't know too much about that war. All I knew was once that home was ready and Miss Rebecca had moved in and that house was ready for company, my job was to stay by my mama's side and make sure that I was her right-hand person, so that whenever anybody came to visit, I was right there, making sure that they got their food, making sure they got their drinks. And I especially loved to serve the company in that gold room. Everybody wanted to come to that beautiful Ashton villa because it was so fancy. Why, there were parties on New Year's Eve, and everybody would come all dressed up, and the music would play, and there was so much beautiful food for everybody to eat. And then, of course, once that war got underway, that's when I started to hear other kinds of conversations. And I started to see soldiers come in. Now, these soldiers, the first ones I ever saw, were soldiers of the Confederacy. Well, I didn't really know what that meant. I just knew they were soldiers from around near us, and they sounded like us, and they were talking about how they wanted to secede from the Union, and they were fighting against the North. And well, Mr. Morrow Brown hosted them around that table. Now, he was not a soldier himself, but because he allowed Ashton Villa to be a headquarters when they needed it, they gave him a name. They called him Colonel. I think he liked it, especially because it meant he didn't really have to go and fight. They just called him Colonel, and sometimes they would pretend to salute him and all kinds of things. Like I said, I was about 10 and not just a little baby anymore. And so I would listen to the conversations that the grown folks were having. And I learned a little bit more about the battle between the Confederate States and this Union Army they said was so terrible. And I learned also that our population in Galveston was changing. Why, when I was real little, and even when my daddy started building the home, there were not so many colored people around I mean, there was a few, but not a lot. But more and more people were coming into Texas, and more were coming into Galveston. And I learned it's because some of those folks who lived up in the north believed and knew that if they could get all the way down into Texas, if the North lost the war or whatever happened, they would be able to keep their slaves. So they brought all these colored folks that crowded around, more people than I'd ever seen. And well, that meant I also was hearing more stories about what happened for people living in slavery. I mean, stories that I hadn't ever experienced myself personally. Now, Sundays, I'm going to tell you a story of what I heard, but I have to explain that on Sundays, of course, nobody worked on Sundays because that was the Lord's Day. And we had a church right in Galveston just for the colored folks. And we would go, and it was not made out of brick. It was made out of fine timber, and it was really quite beautiful. And we liked to go on Sundays because that meant you could see everybody. And of course we could sing and we would dance and we would praise the Lord and hear stories and tell stories and feast. And oh, it was a good day. On this particular day, this particular Sunday, what I noticed was that when there was a little break in the praising of the Lord, that the women were all gathered together and they were talking. And like I said, I was 10. And I knew I had to be careful because if you've been a child or you have children, you know that sometimes grown folk talk about things that are not for children's ears. Do you know what I'm talking about? And sometimes when grown folk get to talk, and when they look around and they see some children, they will say, ah, and they shoo them away. But I had also learned that if I was quiet enough, which I had learned to do beside my mama, feeding and giving drink to all those fancy white men who came and sat around, I knew how to be quiet. So when I saw those women over there talking, I just sidled up nice and quiet and kept looking at the ground so they wouldn't notice me. And they didn't. I don't know if it's because I was so good at camouflage or if it's because they were so engrossed in the story they were telling. Because there was a woman there telling a story about something that she had just encountered. She had been somewhere else out before coming back into Galveston, where they had gone into the woods to pray on a Sunday. She said it was the first time she'd gone out into a place that they called a hush harbor. They called it the hush harbor. They didn't have a church like we had, but they would go into a place where the trees were all gathered around, and it was sacred in the middle of that hush harbor. And that's where they would praise God. And that's where they would sing songs and they would dance and have their prayer meetings out there all day on a Sunday. And this woman said that when they were in that hush harbor, that they were praising the Lord, and all of a sudden, this woman had come running out of the trees right into the middle of the hush harbor. And when they looked at her, they could see that she looked frightened. And she was a mess. Why, her clothes were all tattered and torn, and her face was terrified, and she kept looking over her shoulder, and they could see that she was filthy and she'd been crying. And so the women had gathered around her, and the women had found out what her story was. They said, and this was the part that was not for children's ears, they said that that woman had run away from her slave master because he had come upon her and was trying to have his way with her, and she refused. He said, "You got to." She said, "No." He was trying to make another baby with her. He'd already made one baby with her that had been sold away into slavery. And when that woman saw that and saw him coming back at her, she did not want that to happen. So she had fought him off. And then they said, because she fought him off, he had her tied to a tree, had her top of her dress taken right off. And then he'd had her whipped until her back was bloody. And he left her there in the hot all day. It wasn't until the end of the day that the others dared to come around and untie her and bring her into the cabin and put salve on her wounds. And she said, this woman said that woman said, you know how stories go, but how do you forget something like that? That woman said as soon as her back was healed, she decided to run away. That she'd rather die trying to get free than to let that man lay hands on her one more time or have a baby that would be sold away from her. I couldn't say anything standing next to the women who were telling that story. The woman said to my mama and all the other friends that, of course, the women who gathered around that lady in the Hush Harbor that day, of course, they washed her face and picked all the twigs out of her hair and fixed it up nice, even got her some clean, patched up clothes and a bundle of food. And they laid hands on her. Everybody prayed and they sang and they danced, and she slipped off into the trees. And that woman was talking about it in our church that day because she was praying for her. And she wanted everybody to pray for her. Because she said she didn't know where she went. And all she could do was hope and pray that she was still alive and still free. I have to say, that was the first time that I started thinking about slavery and what it meant for someone like me. That night in the cabin, I knew I wasn't supposed to, but I asked my mama questions. And God bless her, my mama answered every single one. And she said, Melizzy, you got to be careful. You understand? You got to be careful. I said, yes, ma'am. That was a lot. And so I started listening differently to the way the men mostly talked about the war. And I got to thinking, what would happen if the Confederacy didn't win? What might happen? I didn't dare say it out loud. Not many people talked about it. So now we got to fast forward a couple of years. Y'all probably know this because y'all look so smart. And you're right here in the library. So even if you don't know it yet, you can get a book on the way out. It's so wonderful. Or you can look on your computer because they know a lot of things too. But I want to tell you about June 1865. I know you were thinking I was going to talk about the 19th, but you need to know that the excitement about the 19th started on Sunday, June 1865. Now, I told you it was Sunday, and that was the day that we weren't going to necessarily have to work all that much because, you know, Sunday's the day that we would go to church. But I didn't wake up to the sound of anybody getting ready to go to church. I woke up to the sound of feet marching into Galveston, 2,000 feet marching into town, and I could hear a pipe and drum, and I could hear a soldier singing, and they were singing a tune that I had heard soldiers sing before. Yes, we'll rally around the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Yes, we'll rally around the flag, boys, we'll rally once again. again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. But then I heard words I'd never heard before. I was waking up and I could hear him singing, "The Union forever, boys rise, with the tree, with the stars, yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys will rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom." Then I heard him sing a verse like this. "We're calling to our numbers, the loyal, true, and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although they may be poor, not a man shall be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union down with the with the stars, and we'll rally around the flag, boys will rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom." I woke up to this music and I got up and I looked outside. My whole family stumbled to the door and we looked and we saw 2,000 soldiers coming right by. They were not dressed in the Confederate colors. They were dressed in blue and they were singing songs. And when I looked, I could even see colored soldiers in their ranks. And they stopped nearby and two men on horses came right onto the property and they rode their horses right up close in front of Ashton Villa. And I saw Colonel Morrow Brown open up the door. He didn't look happy to see those men on their horses. And then Miss Rebecca came running to our cabin and she said, Mary, you and Melizzy need to get ready. I need your help. We've got company. No time for church. You need to come." No time for church. We weren't even thinking about church at this moment. And so my mama and I hastily got dressed and then we hurried over into the villa. And we got things prepared. And then we brought them all up into that gold room. Excuse me. And well, there was a Union man there. He said his name was General Gordon Granger. And he said that the war was over. He told Colonel Morrow Brown that the Confederacy had surrendered back in April, and he had come to deliver the news that people were free. And he told Colonel Brown to have everybody assemble tomorrow so that he could read the executive orders. And then those two men got up and they left. They got on their horses and they rode away. My mother and I were still in that room. And I tell you what was happening in my heart at this news. I didn't fully comprehend it, but it was so wonderful to hear. And afterwards, Miss Rebecca told us to go and tell our family, and word went out everywhere that people were to assemble to hear an announcement the next day, Monday, June 19, 1865. And so on that day, we were all gathered in the yard when those French doors opened up on the second floor. And General Gordon Granger came out of that gold room and he read General Order Number 3. The people are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them become that between employer and hired labor. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are also informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. He closed up the paper and he turned around and he went back inside. And at first, there was a stunned silence. What had just happened? And then I heard somebody say, you can imagine, oh my goodness, people were yelling and screaming and hugging each other. Some people reached right down on the ground. The earth as a free person for the first time in their lives. People were singing and crying and dancing and it went on for hours. I don't even know when I realized that the white people who had been around to hear this pronouncement were gone, because all of the colored people were there. We were still celebrating. Somebody brought out the wood and we laid out a table and we brought food and we sat and we danced and we celebrated. And to the night I fell asleep with the sounds of jubilation. That was the first Juneteenth that you call it. And it was remarkable. And I wish that I could tell you that from that day on until now, we were free and jubilant and safe and happy. But perhaps you even noticed in that declaration, the proclamation, no idleness allowed here or there. It was used, I suppose, as a way to make sure that colored people who were walking along the roads by themselves or were in places, there's spaces where they weren't wanted. People could arrest them. They could beat them, at the very least. And the fact of the matter is, between the very first celebration and the first anniversary, 500 colored people, mostly men, had been killed. And so when that first anniversary rolled around, we were afraid to celebrate. I mean, we were free, but were we? In the nighttime, my mom and daddy would talk, and they were talking about this place called Freedman's Town up near Houston, where many free Black people, colored folks, had gone. And my mom and daddy decided that we should go, that it might be safer for us to be in a community that could stick together. And so we bundled up the little bit that we had, which wasn't much, of course. And then my mom and my daddy, my brother, my sister, and myself, we climbed into a wagon and we made our way along with a whole lot of other colored folks, the 50 miles north to this free community just outside of Houston. And I gotta say, it felt really good to be there. It felt safe and loving and familiar. And there was a church there, of course. So of course we would go to that church. And The minister at that church was a man by the name of Reverend Jack Yates. Now, he had also come from up north before the war. His wife was enslaved, and her master brought her down, so he came down with her and everything. And now that they were free, he was the minister of this church in this town. And so, of course, on Sundays we would go. And Reverend Yates was the one who said that we needed to have an education. He said everybody needed to learn how to read and write and do arithmetic. And teachers came down from up north, and that's why I could read that to you today, because I learned along with my mom and my daddy, my brother and sister. We all learned how to read and write, do arithmetic. And the other thing around that arithmetic is that Reverend Yates said we needed to pool our money together so that we could buy property that would belong to us, that nobody could take away from us, in a place where we would be safe. Well, it took almost a decade, but we finally put our pennies together, the whole community, and we saved $1,000. And with that $1,000, we bought several acres just outside of Houston, and we decided this was going to be our park. I wonder if you could guess what we decided to name it. Anybody got an idea? Freedom Park. Freedom Park is such a good idea. It's a little tricky because I didn't tell you, we didn't talk about the Emancipation Proclamation at all. Were you going to say Emancipation Park? No?
Hush Harbor.
Oh, Hush Harbor's nice too. But we were not going to be quiet. This was going to be a place where we could be as loud as we wanted to be. We called it Emancipation Park. And on the anniversary of Juneteenth, it was like the 10 years afterwards, we decided we were going to open up that park in the finest fashion. Everybody got all dressed up, and we marched in formation from our town right over to that park, and we marched around and we sang songs, and then people gave speeches and they talked about what freedom meant and what it means. And there were preachers, of course, who preached and all kinds of, and of course we had a feast. We laid out food, all good kinds of food, and some very special things with red in it on purpose. You know, watermelon, we love to have watermelon. It's so good for you. And you can't eat it by yourself. But watermelon and red velvet cake, we always have food with red in it. Can you guess why? I know you're looking at me like, Anybody got an idea why?
It's the color of blood.
Yeah, exactly. You talk like someone who knows about war. The color of blood. And a reminder that freedom didn't come free. A whole lot of blood was shed. And we like to remember that, even as we're celebrating. And the other thing we like to do, even when we're celebrating Juneteenth, is also to think about the places and spaces in life and in the world where people still aren't free, and where blood is being shed so that people can be free. So I'm so thankful that y'all invited me to come and tell my story. And I'm so grateful and touched that y'all here in Providence, Rhode Island, actually have a holiday called Juneteenth now. Probably gonna have some sales at the mall, which is fine. But I do hope that you'll also maybe share some of my story with your family and do a little bit about what, like we do too. think about those places and spaces where freedom isn't yet. And what can we do to help the cause? Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. If you have questions, Valerie's returned. Oh, Melizzy, love you, love you. If you have any questions, I may or may not be able to answer them. But I'm so happy to be able to share that. Yeah. And questions, comments, observations?
I just think this was beautiful, the way you were able to portray that story
Thank you.
and the music beforehand.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Yes.
So you originally created this character for a short video in Connecticut, is that right?
Yes.
So how did that start? Was it really short, and how did it evolve to this?
You know, they asked me to do it in 3 little parts. They asked me to do a story that talked about what slavery was like at that time. So that became that Hush Harbor story I found in the, you know, the archives of former slaves recorded their stories of when freedom came to Texas. So that was actually written down in the Library of Congress, that's in the Texas archives, that you know, a version of the story of this woman who came in with, you know, what I told. So there was that little piece, because you could click on that and you could hear that. And then the Jack Yates was a separate thing. And then I just, you know, made up that. So it's been interesting kind of braiding them together as a full journey. Yeah, so thank you for asking that. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Can you tell us, Valerie, what are things that are gonna be going on around here? that
Thank
we
you.
could,
Sure, that you can participate in.
yeah.
I know that on Juneteenth itself, there will be a program that's free at PPAC. It's being put on by the Juneteenth Rhode Island Committee. Mixed Magic Theater will be there. Rachel Briggs, who's a rib storyteller, will also be performing there. It's at noon. And as far as I know, it's free and open to the public, and most, you know, schools are closed that day. So that is happening. I am doing something this Friday night, not specifically Juneteenth. Freedom is sort of our theme. We're doing a poetry story jam at the Southside Cultural Center. And that's a combination. There's a spoken word artist coming from the Cape. He's an indigenous spoken word artist from the Cape. I'll be telling, Rochelle Coleman will be telling Doors, and there's also open mic. So if you want to come and sing or do something, there's an open mic portion. It's, yeah, you can come and sing. And there's food from Gigi's Southern Cuisine, and it's $5. Doors open at 6:30 and the show starts at 7. So that's then. Let me think if I know. Casey Farm, I don't know if they're doing it. There's something happening Juneteenth in Newport. Yeah, and then a bunch of us are at libraries kind of in the region area. Great, thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
So the folks who formed Freedom Town,
Yes.
how did that evolve? How did those families and individuals, how did that proceed through the decades?
You mean, how did they last very long?
Right.
You know, it was very common following the Civil War and during the time of Reconstruction. I think in part because as people were free, this is when the Klan rose. Because during the Reconstruction period, and again, and I'm not a scholar on this, you know, we've often skipped over Reconstruction, right? Because you have free people and they are getting in positions of power. They're northern folks are going down south and have started freedmen's schools. So many of our historically Black colleges were started at this time with a concerted effort between northern folks, many in the churches and things like that, to go and start these freedom schools. And Black communities, it was safety, you know, to come together and to establish these Black towns. Plus, then, you know, other laws are going into effect, right? Like you can't be out, you can't be in white spaces, right? So then you have a de facto segregation that then becomes institutionalized as Black codes go into effect and that sort of thing. You know, Zora Neale Hurston lived in the all Black town of Eatonville, Florida. So there's so many of these places, but I can't tell you all of that. And I also don't know exactly when or how they, that's a very interesting, yeah, my brain is all going into,
What happened to Melissa?
Hey. I don't know. What do you think? I'll tell you what popped in my head. She fell in love. She got married and she had children and lived a full life. Maybe she became a teacher. I'm making this up now. What do you think?
Why not?
Wow, that could be it.
She moved to Rhode Island.
The only one from all the way down in Texas, all the way up from the biggest state to the littlest one. Maybe her granddaughter came or her girl. Oh, thanks for the question. Woo. Yeah.
Why did they wind up in Galveston to make this pronunciation?
I don't know. Good question. Email me and I'm gonna find out. Does anybody know? All right, will you give me your email? Because I don't know the answer to that. Good, this is the things I need to find out. I don't know. You got me so curious. They what?
It was why Galveston.
There was, yeah, why Galveston? Oh,
It's
that's-
on, is it on the, it's on the
It's
coast.
on the coast.
I wonder if it was the furthest point.
I don't think it's the furthest point. I don't know. I'm gonna find out. Who shall I email? Who's in
Email
charge?
Amy. Email Amy.
Email Amy, okay, and Ruth,
Or me.
and Ruth. And if somebody knows, put it in the chat. And if you don't know, if somebody's Googling, all right. See, I told you I was not a historical scholar, but this is why you helped me. What happened to Melizzi? Okay, and what happened to the Black town? See, these, you're helping. That's why I say when it's new, these are the things that help me grow it.
Will your story change based on what you learn?
Oh, yeah, because let me tell you what happened. Want to hear what happened? I used to say a year ago, I said that Melizzi's family was in the Hush Harbor in the woods. And I was at the library in Little Compton. And there just happened to be a woman who lived in Texas, who had been doing, you know, research in Galveston. She's like, there are no woods in Galveston. And she was the one who told me that there was a wooden church that was a Black church. Like she'd been doing some research. So I said, oh Lord, I gotta figure out how to change that part of the story and get it in. So yes, absolutely. It will change.
Yeah, it's a beach town, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
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 Because that's where they had the big hurricane and the flood.
It's supposed to be quiet. I was supposed to go before COVID, or no, not before COVID. I was invited to a conference there. And then it got, yeah, not because of COVID, but actually it probably was because of COVID. They changed it. It was going to be live and then they did it online. So I didn't end up, but I was like, I need to go there now because I need to, you know, see the villa in person, not just a virtual walkthrough online, which is, you know, good. Yes.
It's interesting that you say about changing it. There was a play that we read, long story we'll go into, and the playwright changed the ending depending upon which city it was being produced in.
Well, you know, this is what I love about storytelling and the oral tradition. right? I mean, there are certain things that need to be passed on verbatim. However, storytelling does live in the moment and needs to be responsive to the people. And it's, you know, we tend to think that if something's written down, it's real, like it's the truth. And just like a spoken word, it might have been truth in that moment, but the more we learn, things have to change. So another change, right? So I have a story that I've been telling since I first went to South Africa in 1988. So I have a folk tale that I heard when I was in South Africa in 1988. It was told in Zulu, which I don't speak. My friend was giving me a bit of an English translation. So my way of telling it is the marriage of that, right? I remember the storyteller, she's given me just enough. I'm making the pictures in my mind. And I recorded that story in the early to mid 90s. It's a story I still tell. I gave the CD to a friend and I thought, you know, I should, who has a little boy, little black 5-year-old. And I thought, oh, I should listen to this CD again. And I realized that in the story that was recorded, I used the word that even my friend used as the best translation she could do, calling the traditional healer a witch doctor. It's 2023. I stopped using that term, you know, at least 10 years ago in the telling of the story. I say Sangoma or Nyanga, this is the traditional healer. And I was like, oh my God, it's stuck on this CD in that way, right? So I emailed her and I said, you know, because I don't want her little black boy. I don't want anybody saying that. I said, here's the caveat. I said, you know, this is the word, this is how I heard it. Da, 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 da. And she so appreciated that, right? Because it has to change in the way as we grow and change. It's the same and it's different. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? You all have been delightful. Come on Friday if you can, Southside Cultural Center. If you're not on the RIBS mailing list, our website is ribsfest.org. We do a lot of our programs hybrid. I'm not sure if this one's hybrid or if it will be recorded. But a lot of our programs we do as a hybrid. So we have our Funda Festival every January. We know people don't necessarily like going out in the winter, but you can stay right at home and Zoom in as your crew is doing tonight. And we would love to keep you connected with our stories. Like I said, Masanko Banda is here from Malawi. He's here till Wednesday. We've gotten him into Tapa school and a daycare that my daughter goes to. He'll go to Croft and he'll be back. So we'd love to share him with the community when he comes back. So thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, I appreciate it. You're coming. Great. Yeah, it's gonna be so fun. I love it. And